PlayStation has no upcoming indie games and it's a real problem. What? What's that? My last video was on a PlayStation exclusive indie game? And two of my most popular videos on the channel are also about PlayStation exclusive indies? And I've gone on record saying these games are 3 of my top 5 most anticipated independent games coming out in the next year? Well, but like PlayStation, like it's still, so there's still a problem, oh god, I've been entangled in my web of lies. When you look at this topic head on, it might sound like much ado about nothing. PlayStation's been in the news recently for the reported treatment of indie devs and how little they actually care about the success of these games. But while this is a topic that we definitely have to talk about in terms of supporting indie developers finding ways for their games to have a fair chance and eliminating the massive payment options that are currently in place to achieve any kind of support from the platform, these are all topics that we need to discuss on the developer side of things. How do we make things better for these developers, because this is a problem for them. On Sony's side of things though, it's a bit harder of a sell to say that they have a big issue on their hands considering how well their consoles sell, how well their games do both commercially and critically, and like I mentioned in the little intro there, how many outstanding indie titles they currently have an exclusive lock on. But when I started to think on it more, I realized that Sony seems to be doing the same thing with its indie titles as it is with its AAA ventures. And while their formula is working great for bigger budget titles despite the backlash that's also gotten over the past few months, the indie space is very different, and if they're not careful, they could actually start to see their treatment of third-party indies come back to bite them in the ass a little bit. Just to recap for those who might not know, certain indie devs have both publicly and anonymously reached out to Kotaku or tweeted out to the world about how difficult it is to work with Sony as an indie dev. Mainly how throwaway they treat your product once it launches. Reportedly, devs need to pay upwards of 25 grand just to be featured somewhere on the PlayStation Store, and that number can shoot up to even 200,000. Without this promotion, you basically get lost in the sauce. The main storefront of PlayStation is not really a place to discover new games, it's just a place to buy ones you already know about. And I didn't even think of that until this article came out, but despite being a PlayStation fan with PlayStation being my primary way of playing games, I don't think I've ever gone on there to find a new game. Unless there's a sale where almost all the time you need to scrub through multiple pages before you filter out all the AAA stuff. Compare that to Steam and Xbox, I've probably spent more time looking through those storefronts as well as Game Pass in the past month than I do in a year on PlayStation, which used to be my only console for a really long time. Just in looking through these storefronts a little bit, I found games like Ultra Kill and Proteus, retro style shooters that are totally up my alley and insanely fun. I've picked up demos for promising games. Smack dab in the middle of the screen when I opened up Xbox Game Pass last week were the games Going Under and Bloodroots, the latter of which I've played before and love and is a super under-discussed title, and the other that I've never heard of, and while I didn't fall in love with it, I had a good time playing it and I know a lot of people are really gonna enjoy that game. Hopping over to Nintendo as well, I remember seeing Aerial Knights Never Yield on there a couple months back and thinking, wow, I did not expect to see this here. This felt as quiet as it gets before release, and it was right there when I opened up the store. Hell, I only knew of Bloodroots originally because I saw it on the eShop last year, and fun fact, that game wasn't even launched on Xbox originally, and yet I've still seen it more on that store page than PlayStation's. The big kicker for me was when I remembered this list I made of the best indie games that were at E3. Now, in fairness, Sony wasn't at E3, and Microsoft was, so the fact that 2 games from the Microsoft showcase were on here, and absolutely no Sony exclusives were on there, you can't really hold that against them, right? But everything else was at third-party shows. They could be on whatever platform, it didn't matter. And a lot of these games were not your heavy-hitter titles that these publishers wanted to get proper exclusivity to. You'd expect them to be on every console as long as they had decided to port to consoles in the first place, but there were only 2 games on that list that were coming to PlayStation. And even if these games do decide to bring it over to that platform, it wouldn't do much good for either the devs or Sony because the game gets so lost it might as well have not released unless it has some level of more rigorous marketing. Now here's the kicker, right? Sony actually has a special branding and focus on its indie division. In the same way they've started labeling their first or third-party exclusives under the PS Studios banner, PlayStation Indies is also a whole thing, and the stuff we've seen revealed under this banner has been really impressive. It's pretty comparable to the quality of their major releases. These games look very polished and pristine and like the cream of the crop. And I'm very happy with the selection of games we have here, but as one dev mentions, Sony sees indies as games that make money in the low millions. Anything smaller than that basically doesn't exist in their eyes. These games, when they release, will undoubtedly be showstoppers in the space, but Sony seems to be prioritizing quality over quantity when other platforms have shown that it's entirely possible to have both. Amazing indies that come out of nowhere are released all the time, and a platform like Steam is completely loaded up with them. There's so much choice and the storefront is so good now that players buy more games they like and developers sell more copies of their games. It's a win-win. The amount of games being released into the world is rapidly growing. Look at these Steam stats. Of course, part of this is just Steam becoming more popular and more people people targeting it, but part of it is also how easy it's become to get your foot in the door with development, with stuff like Unity and Unreal Engine being so user-friendly. This uptick in games is aligning with the prevalence of the subscription service model in the industry, which is making it so that you can pay a lot less money for a lot more. The end result is that people are less inclined to pay a heap of money for one game when they could pay the same amount for access to hundreds of games for multiple months. And if they did want to spend money on individual games, there are so many out there for dirt cheap and you can squeeze dozens of hours out of them. Buying expensive games is becoming less of an easy thing to do. And although that hasn't affected Sony's AAA sales, when you're talking about indies, that higher price point which Kane approves will usually be the case, combined with the more limited overall options, doesn't look very appealing. And since AAA games tend to come out as a drip feed throughout most of the year, which leads to a lot of people playing smaller supplemental titles in the meantime, I think PlayStation could lose a bit of the balance it currently has with at least one portion of their player base. It could become a console that you go on every so often instead of retaining its players year-round, since it's currently the worst destination for indie fans who want to play a lot more than just a handful of titles every year. Not because it flat out doesn't have these games, but it just never shows them to you, and they're clearly starting to lose the good graces of a lot of devs who'd probably much rather not have to spend the effort of porting the game over to PlayStation if it means they'll get almost zero return on that investment. Basically, I think that without an improved storefront that gives players the option and devs the ability to benefit from the clear surge of indie titles, PlayStation limits the output to its audience and in turn starts to feel like a luxury brand that the average consumer might abandon for an option that's cheaper and gives them more. That outcome plays hand in hand with subscription services, of course, but it starts with Sony neglecting a massive chunk of developers to a point where they might just leave the platform. And if you think growth of indie games isn't important to a company like this and the amount of hardware and software it can sell, remember that Sony has been pushing its brand for indie games for years. This is clearly very important, but they might just be doing it all wrong. Thanks for watching, guys. Short video, short outro. Subscribe if you enjoyed. Also leave a like. Check out the rest of the channel. I got some fun stuff on there, and I'll see you next time. Peace.